So you're working to save that $10,000, or you've got $10,000 in the bank. The biggest thing that I think a lot of people get confused about is they try to start to think through all these super complex things, right? They're going, all right, well, I'm trying to save this $10,000. My buddy says put it in Bitcoin. My other buddy says, buy a house, buy Airbnbs. My other buddy says, put it into some penny stock. Another buddy says, well, if I put $1,000 in Tesla in 2011, it'd be worth $150,000 right now. So that's what we should be doing. And it really comes back to understanding a couple key factors, okay? First, if we're going to be saving $10,000, I genuinely think you have two accounts. That's it, only two accounts, okay? So you have a checking account, you have a savings account. It's as simple as it can come, okay? You put your money into your savings account, that's extra. You put all of your other income into your checking account to pay your bills. Now, you go back through, you look at what's variable, what's non-variable, okay? And then you sit there, you say, okay, if I can save $750 to $1,000 a month, all of that extra money just goes into a savings account, okay? And I'm gonna share the specific type. But what we do then is now that can take us, if we have those side hustles, we got a side hustle lined up, we're trimming trees here, we're raking leaves, we're doing whatever we can to make an extra $500 a month. Now let's say we're expediting this process, so we're saving that $1,000. We do that over 10 months. Then what we're doing is that first step. We get the $10,000 saved. Now the second step, okay, we go through this, we get $10,000 saved. We open up a high yield savings account. Okay, so we want to find a high yield savings account. Just Google any bank or anybody online. There's a lot of different high yield savings that will return between 4 and 5% depending upon interest rates on that time of year or on that specific year. Okay, don't even worry about putting money into a Roth. Don't worry, and I know a lot of people are going to say you're crazy for saying that. Do not worry about putting money into an emergency fund. Don't worry about any of those specific factors. Simply save $10,000 in an old school savings account. Now, if you can get that done in 5 to 10 months, the next step, okay, now we have that one account. We open up a high yield savings, okay? We move that money into the high yield savings. Now, the next step that we're gonna do, once we have this $10,000 saved, we're not stopping. We're setting this up, and the big factor next is now we want to chip away at our emergency fund, okay? So the emergency fund is something that we're going to figure out, we're going to dial in. It's going to be 6 months of expenses, okay? So if anything tragic happens, if anything happens as far as the stock market, you lose your job, you get injured, whatever it might be, now you can look at that and you can say, okay, for 6 months, let's say my expenses are, if I'm making $70,000 a year, let's say I'm spending just $5,000 a month to cover everything, food, electric, housing, rent, stuff like this. Okay, so if I'm spending $5K a month times 6, the next benchmark theoretically is that I got to save $30,000. Okay, so the next thing then is that we've got to take that money that we just took, that we proved to ourselves, now we made $10,000. The next thing is we moved all of that money, the 10 grand, into the high yield, okay? You put it into the high yield, and now you've got, at this point, you start to chip away at that $30,000. So you only have to move another 20K in there. And this could take anywhere from, another 6 to 18 months. Now, the one thing I wanted to bring up with this is that when you have the high yield savings, okay, and you're figuring this out, and you're going, all right, well, if I'm saving this emergency fund and it's going to have 30K in it, I think it's important at this point to recognize that you can, especially if you're younger, if you don't have kids and you're younger, you can take a little bit more risk at this point, okay? So if you do have an interest in something like, I want to buy a house instead of living in living in an apartment, that's one thing that you can do now is you can sit there and say you have 15K. It's not going to get you the greatest house, but it's something where you could possibly set up to buy a home, and then you can have that home and rent that to one or two of your friends who then helps pay your mortgage. So while you're working and you have this side hustle, you're saving everything, you're chipping away, and you're making these sacrifices that you're not going to spend extra, you're not going to go out, you're not going to drink, you're not going to go to the movies. You're going to figure out ways to make extra money on the side hustle. Then you're saving everything into a savings account traditionally. You're not even worrying about a Roth yet. You're not even worrying about any of that stuff because it can really detract from your momentum and from your speed. And I think that's the big factor here, is that when you recognize that your speed and that you can move things a lot quicker than you realize, then you can get to the point where within 1 year you save 10K and you can max out your Roth, because now you're starting to save that money faster. You have a high yield savings that's getting you a decent return, like not amazing, but it's not terrible. You're getting a decent return on it. And then you have an extra amount of money because you have your emergency fund, and you can start strategically thinking. Now, the next thing that I would recommend is be patient. Okay, so I know I said, like, yeah, you might take this opportunity now to go and pick up some type of real estate or something like that. But what I recommend is being as patient as possible and sitting there and saying, okay, let's sit on the cash. Let's try to put some of this into a Roth, because now we have that 6 month, that emergency fund established. Let's put some of this into a Roth. Okay, so that chips away at that, which is going to pay off. But it really comes back to moving money from the high yield, okay, into a Roth, moving money from a high yield potentially into some other down payment. But the big factor here, once you establish, okay, you start off with those two accounts. You got your basic checking, you got your basic savings. Then the next thing, you add in the high yield savings. You build towards that emergency fund from after you have the $10,000 saved. And then once we build through that emergency fund, you start to feed into the Roth, okay? And you start to slowly build from the Roth. And then the next step is you start to be patient and you think through, what do I want here long term? Do I want to have a house? Do I want to start to put things and max out my Roth? Does your employee offer some type of match where if you put money into a SEP or a 401k, if that happens, how high is that when you can max that out as well? But the big aspect here is that oftentimes when you have somebody who doesn't really have money yet and they're trying to save towards that 10K, they get so overwhelmed by all these stories from their friends, all these stories about meme coins, all these stories about all these other things, and then you're sitting on $15,000 to $30,000 that you've never really been able to sit on before, and you start to think about, you start having the itch that you want to buy more things. You want to buy a jet ski, you want to buy a boat, you want to buy a brand new car, and you don't want to succumb to any of that stuff yet. You want to let it build and play it as a game. Okay? You've got the high yield savings, play that game, get that as high as possible. And if you do end up taking, let's say, 3 months of that emergency fund out to put into some type of asset, don't do anything else until you build back to that 6 months. And then the next thing that you do is when you establish that that is like the rule of your game, is that you can't take out of that emergency fund. Once you establish that rule, now what you start to do is you start to play around and you recognize that you start to make better decisions long term and you don't get distracted. So I think the number one rule, establish the checking and the savings. Number 3 rule, get the high yield savings account. That's the first step towards like learning things when you're trying to save that $10,000. Once you save the $10,000, move it into the high yield savings. Okay, then you're going to work towards that 6 months. That 6 months of saved expenses is the next big factor. Okay, so then you get to that 6 months point, and now we're on the road to building towards $100,000. I hope this helped. Peace.